And so, welcome back. We'll soon be starting with the second panel of today, the title of which is Good Governance, Everybody Should Get Involved. And we are starting with an introductory video, and we'll see the interview with Royal Highness Prince Faisal Hussein, Vice President of the IOC Women's in Sports Commission, who is also the President of the Jordan National Olympic Committee.
Well, I think sports can teach a lot of great lessons, both for men and women. It teaches you how to work together, issues of self-esteem, of perseverance, other than being a very, very healthy lifestyle, being active. So I think women have a lot that they can gain from being in sport. I think the challenge for us is to encourage women to go into what is considered in a lot of places a very male-dominated society, and to play their rightful role and to gain all the benefits that men do from playing sports. We're finally seeing almost equity in terms of athletes. The real challenge for women is more in leadership roles and in administrative roles. Unfortunately, I think we've still got a long way to go to encourage women to take leadership positions, to continue as part of their career. When I first joined the Women in Sports Commission, the target was 20% gender equity. Now it's 30%, hopefully by 2020. We are seeing moves in the right direction. And it's also, as I said, the challenges in bringing women in leadership roles in the Olympic movements. And I think we're seeing the trend move in the right direction. Obviously, we'd like to see it, I think, move quicker than it is. The biggest thing is that men need to understand the challenges that women face in sports, and particularly some of the obstacles that are put in front of them, and to help them be able to overcome those obstacles. So, as a man, I think part of the challenge is convincing in a very male-dominated sporting environment to convince other men the importance of allowing women to play their part. The last Women in Sports Congress in Los Angeles, they had a great byline, you know, together we're stronger. This is what we need to get the message out, that together men and women working side by side can produce so much more, can be so much more productive. Not just in sports, but in society in general. All the studies that we've seen have shown that, for instance, companies that have at least 30% of their boards with women are more successful in business. Societies that allow women to play a greater role have greater growth. There's so much benefits of having men and women working alongside. We can benefit from the opportunity to have better gender equity and allowing women and men to contribute to the development of their society. And I think that's the key message.
Now, please welcome the moderator of this discussion panel, Mr. Matthias van Baelen, who is the Deputy Director of the EOC EU office in Brussels. He was the project manager of the project Support the Implementation of Good Governance in Sport. Mr. Baelen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second panel discussion of today, where we will combine the topic of gender equality with good governance. We have heard already some very interesting contributions by the speakers, so I challenge my panelists today to be as insightful as the first panel, so I look forward to their contributions. But first, let me start by giving some figures. According to the recent IOC survey on gender equality, it was shown that women only make up 19.7% of NOC executive boards in Europe. Only 8 out of the 50 NOCs in Europe has achieved the 30% minimum target that was set by the IOC Executive Board last year in November. Out of the 50 NOCs in Europe, only 4, as we have heard already, have a female president, and only 8 have a female secretary general. I work for the European Olympic Committee's EU office in Brussels, and last year and the year before we have implemented an European project which was called Support the Implementation of Good Governance in Sport, or SIX. I hope many of you are actually familiar with that project. What we have done is we have developed a self-evaluation tool for national Olympic committees and national sport federations. This tool allowed an organization, by doing self-evaluation, to get an overview of their strengths and weaknesses, and on top of that, based on these weaknesses, to get concrete action plan of where they can increase, where they can improve their performance. This tool is available online, so I invite all of you to try it out. But why do I tell you this information? Because in the process of the project, we have also gathered information from around 220 national federation and national Olympic committees in 8 different countries across Europe. And in this evaluation, we have used 20 different indicators. We had, for instance, personal integrity, we had sanction system, we had decision-making procedure, and one of them was related to gender equality. And the questions that we raised related to this indicator were, for instance, do you have a specific commission that is dealing with the topic, or do you have a certain strategy to increase gender equality within the organization? And what did we see in terms of results? Across all countries and across all sports, gender equality was always, or in most of the cases, among the lowest, and in most of the cases, actually the lowest of all 20 indicators. And it seems that when we have a look on the results, that actually the most problematic case is that there was no formalized, no strategy at all to increase gender equality within the organization. So if we go back to the IOC goal that was set for 30%, minimum 30% of women in decision-making procedures by 2020, and we link that with the figures that I've just said before, and with the fact that many organizations so far seem not to have a formal strategy. The question is really, and this is the question I think we should discuss in this panel here today, is how are we going to achieve this 30% by 2020, which is only 3 years away from now. Good governance and gender equality touch upon many issues which we will cover here today in the panel, and many things were already mentioned before. It's about creating a culture that encourages, and I specifically like that word, empower women to stand for elections. It's about providing platforms where to discuss how to promote and encourage gender equality within an organization, and how to decide on concrete strategies to encourage gender equality. And it is about making sure that it's not a topic, it was mentioned already several times, that is only discussed by women, but everybody should get involved. So that it be clear, gender equality is a good governance issue. And equally, in the project 6, we have done a lot of training sessions, and we've sit together with a lot of organizations. And one of the key messages that we wanted to show was, for a sports organization, there is a lot to gain from good governance. And let it be clear, there's a lot to gain from gender equality as well. So good governance, leadership, elections, decision-making processes, and all of these elements are all elements that we will discuss here today in the panel. And I'm very honored to introduce to you the following speakers. We have a very interesting panel for you. First of all, I would like to introduce Mr. David Saunders, who is a representative of the United Nations Women in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Please. Our next panelist is Kristina Thuree. She's the chair of the Equality Within Sport Committee of the European Non-Governmental Sports Organization, ENGSO, and this was formerly known as the European Women and Sport Network. Welcome, Kristina. Yes. The third panelist that I am happy to introduce to you is Mr. Brian Lewis. He's the president of the NOC of Trinidad and Tobago and the president of the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees. Welcome, Brian. And last but not least, Dr. Donna Haan. She's currently the head of Access, Equity and Identity in Sport at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences and the international coordinator for the sports department. So, good afternoon, everyone. Maybe before, as a first start for this panel, maybe can I ask you to explain a bit? We've heard already about United Nations Women, that there is this memorandum of understanding, but can you maybe give a bit more information about what you are exactly doing and what is your exact function within UN Women?
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you for inviting UN Women to join you here today. It's very appropriate, especially as sport is such a truly merit-based arena, especially on the field. I think UN Women essentially strives to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of women. But of course, individuals excel in different areas. Women and men are different, and therefore they may need different support or access to services to thrive. And so leaders are obviously essential to ensure that every woman and every man can really meet their potential, economically, politically. You've actually changed the question, haven't you? So essentially, UN Women, if I go back to the question, is far more focused, essentially is focused on kind of advising, encouraging, cajoling governments, essentially trying to ensure they meet global standards and ensure that they are held to account. They invest in intelligent policy and practice and that they drive those forward. And obviously our focus is very much on human rights, women's rights, tackling injustice and leaving no one behind. Obviously our work covers a whole range of areas. People are often familiar with our work in peacekeeping or humanitarian, but the majority of UN work happens every day in governments all around the world, typically outside the EU.
Okay. Should I turn now to the actual question that I was supposed to raise? So thank you for explaining this. We've already heard about a very successful He for She campaign. And after this campaign, we've seen a mobilization around world leaders who actually pledged to achieve gender equality in 2030. Yeah. We've also seen the figure, we heard the figures earlier for the situation in sports organizations, and as we know around the world today, we have 20 countries that have currently a woman as a head of state or government, and women only make up 23.5% of national parliaments. So is achieving gender equality by 2030, is it an ambitious vision?
Clearly it is ambitious, but there's absolutely no time to waste. I'd also stress that when governance structures and leaders commit to change, it can happen quite quickly. You're going to hear too many references to a country I've been working in for 4 or 5 years, Albania, where we have seen huge change in a relatively short time. The He for She campaign is quite interesting because it was designed around the idea that men and boys should engage to tackle bias, tackle discrimination, tackle violence against women. But possibly it's been more important for getting people engaged to empower women and girls. 1.3 billion different conversations have been held since 2015, and over 1.5 million personal commitments to action, of which 75% were from men and boys. But what I would stress is that across the world, possibly partly through this campaign, leaders like the President are committing to change in institutions, and most of them are focusing on equality at senior levels in leadership. But there's also a lot more pragmatic things can happen much lower down. The president of Malawi has made huge strides in addition to quotas, but in tackling child marriage. One chief actually abolished 330 youth marriages in 2015. The mayor of Tirana, Mayor Velier in Albania, within 3 weeks of getting survey results on safety or poor safety in the city, for women in particular, he was investing a small fortune, millions, in street lighting and in infrastructure, changing the priorities. And now Tirana, he's holding it up as a vision of a child-friendly city as the way forward. The CEO of Vodafone, Vittorio Colau, another impact champion, like the president, also made major commitments, and one of them is, again, this 30% quota by 2020. But in Albania, where I was, they implemented that within a year. He was holding 6 monthly conference calls globally with his whole workforce. They've established advocacy champions, women advocacy champions in every office. And they've increased flexibility in women's work contracts. So very quickly, change can be driven if leaders have the power to make that change. But I think the other thing is that women really thrive where they can. So again, we often see in areas like the Balkans or the Middle East, women thrive in academia because it's open to them as students, as faculty members. And then when the opportunity arises, they can then seize it and shift across. So they can be involved more in politics, more in groups like the Olympic Committee. And some countries see this change very fast. I realize I'm talking to a European audience, and in Europe, generally, we're far ahead of other countries in terms of equality in governance, but at leadership levels, maybe not. But for example, in Albania, in just a 5-year period, they went through a huge shift with 2 elections, a national and a local election, to see we now have 50% of women in Albania in cabinet, up from 1 in 20 in 2013. We have 26% of MPs in cabinet, up from 17.5%. And we see similar shifts at other levels. In fact, at local council level, it's even higher, 35%, up from 12.5% in 2013. So things can change very fast if there is a drive and if the women within the system are empowered to make a step. And I think this is where we may have lessons for other institutions. But in answer to your question, yes, we are ambitious, but we are seeing genuine change, and sometimes this is happening very quickly. So I don't think we should be shy. I think we should be ambitious. I think everybody has that opportunity to step up, men and women, to increase equality. And often it is very important that men are willing not to step aside, but to put a hand down to help people up. And I think that's a key part of this. Clearly, we're all better off together. But the secret is for those people in leadership positions, whoever they are, to encourage diversity and encourage equality and then merit-based systems.
Okay, very interesting. Kristina, if I turn to you, so you are currently the chair of the Equality Within Sport Committee. Could you explain a bit what this committee is doing, or what is it all about, and what is your role as a chair?
Yes, but I will start with a question of what has happened during a lot of years. Since I was involved actually 20 years ago, I was a member of the Swedish Sports Confederation, the Executive Committee, and was then responsible for the European work on women in sport to secure and develop and see what can be done to get women in sport federations. And in that work, I worked with Irena Shewinska. You were in the group too, 20 years ago. Hello, Irena. So we decided quite soon that it was, at that time, it was the nature of the women. It was a women's issue. And to be concrete, I will mention 4 areas. And then I'll tell how I see it after 20 years when I came back to business, came back to this European business. 20 years ago, 4 areas. It was very clear that sport was developed for men, by men. Real men get together. That was the situation in that sense. Men was the norm. And why question it? For example, statistics. Why show how it was? It was a shame to show, oh, you should not lift up the numbers of women executive committees, because men was the norm by then. Third, women in sport, that was a separate issue, a working group on women in sport. Separate issue that could have been separate women's sport organizations by then. And fourth, that women needs education. Someone said this morning that women, she cannot do sport, she don't know sport. So therefore she needs to be educated. That was to learn the male way of sport. That was the situation 20 years ago. So how did I see it 2 years ago when I came into this business again as chair of this committee? Well, first of all, it's very clear and open doors that you show the situation. You show statistics, you visualize how is the situation. Today, Thomas Bach and the EOC acting president said, it's a shame that there's not so many women. That was not over the question 20 years ago. Now the men lift up this and visualize the situation. Secondly, women in sport is not a separate issue. It's an action of doing mainstream and go into sport itself. It's good governance. That's for sure. Everyone accepts it. It's accepted that it is. 20 years ago, it was educated women. The women need to learn. Now we've heard several times today, empower women, encourage to take the step. No discussion about that the competence is by women and men to encourage individuals, human beings, to step forward nominations. That's the third difference. And the fourth, about the culture, male culture of sport. Is it equal today? Yes and no. We see women and men acting together, participating, but we're not really there, so there's still a lot to do. So if I see what was that 20 years ago and what has happened now, what has happened during these 20 years? A lot of things. Discussion has been ongoing. Mention externally and internally sport what has been done, because externally what I see immediately when I came back into business, what the Council of Europe and the European Commission, very strong, strategic, lifted up the importance of equality and left it to the sport decide by themselves, but encouraged in lifting up the areas that are important. For example, European Commission proposal for strategic actions 2014 to 2020. That was the job that has been ongoing, lifting up 4 strategic areas. Concrete areas, focus. First, decision-making. Second, gender stereotypes and the media role. Third, gender-based violence, fight against that. And fourth, coaches. Female as coaches, the norm as coaches. These 4 areas, strategic actions. But that was not the Commission itself that did it, but we did it because of the policy work of ENGSO, European Non-Governmental Sport Organization. They really pushed that now we want to have this concrete action strategic lifted up in the document. So there's a long work has been ongoing, but that means the work is discussion, you're concentrating the focus, you have the areas that are of priority. The same Council of Europe, the mainstreaming recommendations we heard of today, that's also something happening with the support of the policy work of the sport organizations, among others the ENGSO. Also there have been some projects during these whiles, Erasmus Plus projects, that has been running by, for example, ENGSO. For example, the leadership, WILD project, where the coaching projects, SCORE project, successful one talking about mentorship for coaches and education material for coaches, where men and women are involved in that. Also the fight against gender-based violence. And of course, participate in the sport and the governmental part, participating in the work, for example, the BIS project that also Council of Europe representative talked about. So see, it's not an easy task. It's a lot of work that has been ongoing. And ENGSO Equality within Sport Committee is part. We have the expertise and could be coaching, we can be networking, we know the strategies, what make success. Where are the examples of good practices? We can give it so you can learn from each other. That's a role that we can have.
Okay, very interesting, and it's good to see your passion for this topic as well. The IOC, through the Olympic Agenda 2020, has asked the Olympic movement to accept and comply with basic universal principles of good governance. What are, according to you, the steps that leaders should take to move the needle in the right direction?
I think it's, first of all, two parts. First of all, to accept and understand what is good governance. We talked about today, it's clear about that gender equality is not a women's issue, it's a human right. To be aware of what is good governance, what is the equality, gender equality question. And understand that it's not an issue of educating women, it's a question of encourage, empower human beings to take part in the work. Also important to understand take the step of good governance. Third, it's very important that you realize that effective, creative, result-oriented teams, executive committees, commissions, etc., consist of women and men acting together. That's good governance. Acting together, developing sport. We have different experiences, and we need the balance in that groups to make results of good governance. And of course, to act in a positive way, positive momentum, instead of threats and so. Act positively. We need the brave man, he for she, the brave man that encourages women and act together with women instead of, and of course brave women too, to act together. So gender balance instead of sameness, I think Halle said. It was a very good impression. So I think that's, as a start, to understand that good governance is this, what we're talking about, doing together, acting together, and understand that the situation.
Since we're
concrete action, shall I come to that, or can I take it afterwards? You want me to finish?
Okay, we can take it afterwards. And,
yeah.
Brian, after you, we've been talking about the importance of good practice examples, for instance. Could you maybe give an example of a good practice example in terms of good governance or gender equality from your part of the world?
So before I answer that specific question, because the issue that is the subject of this forum is not one that it's an issue. The Olympic movement and sport is a male citadel. And the real challenge is, despite everything we talk about, we all know what we would like to see and what we would like to get done. But how do you get more women in charge of the old boys club? Mm-hmm. So even in this room here, we have colleagues of mine, just that we come from a different region, a different continent. But I'm a president of an Olympic committee. I'm president of the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees. To my mind, there is too much and too many of us who live in denial. We deny that there is a problem, some of it purely for self-interest, because some of us don't want to give up the power and the status and the perks. How are we going to move the needle? How are we going to embrace all the things that have been spoken about, all the things that will be spoken about? We'll be talking about it for the next 100 years if something doesn't happen. We have to practice what we preach. The bottom line is, for the needle to move, if you want to get it to 30%, I believe in 50%, which is what I ensured happened on the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee. I ensured that we had a Secretary General, female, for the first time in 70 years. We have a staff that is all female. We have females that go into chef de missions. We have females that are making the important decision. They're not there just to simply help men look good. They're there to chart the direction. How are we going to move the needle? We're only going to move the needle given the fact that, as you read the statistics, There are even more statistics that will startle people, because there is no statistic that I have seen in the context of gender that is more than 20% in the Olympic movement, whether it is on NOCs, whether it is on EBs, whatever. How do we move the needle? Men have to give it up. So if you want to move to 30%, then there's a certain percentage of men who have to give it up. And it's not a question of where men feel it's unfair, and even the women who are benefiting feel that it's diminishing their achievement because they don't want to be, you know, they didn't get it because they're a woman, they got it because of merit. The bottom line is that we are where we are, and all the talk and all the checking the boxes in the world, it's not going to happen unless we practice what we preach. NOCs and the current leaders have to deliberately set out to say, I am going to be the change that I want to see. Some of us have to simply say, here what? I am going to do my best, just like I would have done for men in the past, to create the pathway for the next president of my NOC to be a female, or the next president of the IOC to be a female. That's the kind of conversation we need to have. We need leadership that buys into the talk. In terms of examples of good governance, the Caribbean is no different from the statistics. And therefore, if good governance, gender equality, and parity is good governance, then there's an absence of good governance. Because one of the characteristics of good governance is inclusion and diversity. And for me, even though I talk a lot about gender equality and gender parity, I prefer to focus on gender balance. Because whether it is sport, whether it is business, whether it is whatever, we need to get gender balance. There are studies that will show 60% of the women, 60% of people coming out of universities now are female. There are studies that show when there's gender balance, you get better decision making. You now have women leading some of the biggest companies in the world, Pepsi, General Motors. It's no longer an excuse for the world of sport. I have made it plain. I feel that, and this is no offense to all of us, we're focusing a lot on the athletes and getting the field to 50-50. But in a very real way, that's a low-hanging fruit. Because if we're going to talk about 50-50 on the field, we should be talking about 50-50 in the leadership and in the decision-making. So there's a tinge of double standards there that we need to look at. But then I'll just end there for the time being and pass it to
because you're taking all my words.
No, thank you for this this very strong message.
Yeah.
Thank you for this. Up to Donna, then as a researcher, we've talked about credibility of the movement, what leaders have to give up. Why is credibility in terms of good governance, implementing good governance, why is that so important for the Olympic movement and for leaders to act on?
I think, and credibility, I think, is the important word in beyond why is good governance important, the credibility of it, because how we govern is how we want the world to see us. So how people view our sport, what's okay, what's not okay, where are the boundaries, what's acceptable, not acceptable. We set those rules through our governance. And so we have to send that message if we believe the Olympics movement, for example, is a value-led movement and we believe in fairness, we have to govern with the same values. with that same parity. And I always refer back to being a parent. The rules that I set for my children are how I expect them to behave at home. But I also expect them to behave a certain way in society, in the society that I live in the culture that I live in. And I think a governance is the same perspective. Yes, we have lots of different socio-cultural positions in which sport is governed, and the role of men and women in these societies are very different, and we have to be aware of that. But we still have to set the tone as to what is acceptable behavior and what is not. And Brian, as you said, on the playing field, we'll say 50%. And if we don't get 50%, you can't come and play. You can't come to the Olympics. We won't let you play because you're not following our rules. And we need to have that same confidence in terms of governance. In terms of 30% is not equality. And we see that organisations will tick that box. We've got 30%. We don't need to find any more women. But that's not equality. And we also have to move beyond equality to talk about equity. And I think that's the key game changer. That one of the panel members previously talked about transformation. Equality doesn't get you transformation in an organisation. It will bring about change. To get the transformation in an organisation, you need equity. And that's not about how many of each gender are sat around the table. It's about how we communicate with each other and how we listen to each other. And so that's also part of good governance.
Okay, I think one of the main reasons why they asked you to be part of this panel was your quite interesting research project on understanding and finding the role of men in achieving gender equality. Could you say a bit more about this research and some of the findings?
Yeah, so we were inspired by the He for She campaign. We've been researching gender equality in sport for a long time, and nothing new is really coming out, and the changes are not happening quick enough. So we wanted to look at it from a different perspective. And it's not just about leadership, it's about a cultural change. And so in order to create cultural change, you need to engage everybody involved in the culture, this transformation, so men and women. So we used two sports, triathlon and rowing, and we interviewed board members, male and female board members at the IF level and at the National Federation in the Netherlands and in Australia. And we were looking at the difference between what we say we do and what we actually do. So the difference between having quotas and having women sat around the table to actually what is it like to be one of the women at the table or one of the men at the table, and how a decision's made, the recruitment process. And men are the gatekeepers in sport, and so we need to engage in that population in order to open the doors. And all the other things that previous panel members have talked about, the confidence, that women underestimate their confidence or are less confident, don't necessarily put themselves forward in the same way that men do, need to be asked several times to stand for election and to understand the election process and to engage both genders in that election process. And I think, going back to the cultural side, one of the key things that I wasn't expecting was triathlon is a new sport. When we asked the members, male or female, international federation, national federations, about gender equality, their resounding response was, it's in our DNA. That's who we are. Everything we do in this sport is about equality. It kept coming back. It's in our DNA. It's what we do. That's the cultural difference. And again, that has to come back, like Brian said, in terms of the IOC and in terms of federations. We have to be brave and we have to make it a cultural thing in everything, in the images that we use, in the language that we use, in our governance of acceptable behavior. It has to be in everything that we do. It has to be in our DNA.
Okay. If I can go back to you, David, we've talked about the World Economic Forum and this global gender gap report before, and about how long it would take to close the economic gender gap. So according to the 2016 report, it would take 93 years to close this gap in Eastern Europe, and it would take 45 to close this gap in Western Europe. What experience have you encountered in relation to equality and inclusion in your career?
Well, now I'm going to turn the tables on you and not answer the question.
Okay.
Is this very loud? It seems it. I'd like to come back to the conversation, because if I move back to global issues, I think we're moving a lot of the focus of the discussion. And I particularly like the point where we're now focusing on the change process needed. So I think in order to change good governance across an institution, it's essential that that goes very deep. It can't just be a veneer at any level. And Brian talked about dramatic change at the top and people really committing to that and living that through, but it works throughout a whole institution. And I would probably argue there's maybe 3 or 4 primary issues to tackle this. The first, I would argue, as has come up in many discussions, is about the data, the indicators. Analysis of data within the institution, sex disaggregated data about women and men across the institution at different levels, from the Olympic movement at the grassroots level, management of the sporting events, through to the very top, would clearly help people understand the situation. So what are the position roles different people play at different levels? What is the pay differential at different levels between men and women? When do people leave the profession? Are they predominantly women at a certain age or men at a certain age? We've got to understand all of these details so we can then focus on unblocking barriers and really consciously tackle those issues as leaders and managers. For example, if you have 2 equal candidates for a post, always recruit the woman, never recruit the man. It's a simple step. They're both equally qualified. You should never recruit the man now until you've got parity. How can flexibility in working hours be introduced? Clearly, women prefer and women thrive better when they have flexible contracts. So provide it. It's not difficult. It's not rocket science. Childcare was mentioned in earlier stages, but that's a very obvious one. The issue of women on committees is again, very simple. You should never have one woman on a committee. Now, when you elect for office, it's a bit more challenging to understand. But if it's not electoral-based, you should never have one woman on her own, because she will feel cornered. She will not be able, unless she's extremely, even if she is tough, it will still be harder for her to bring her points forward. And then I'm assuming the IOC has policies of anti-discrimination and harassment in place. I'd be very curious to know how often they're actually applied. If zero tolerance is applied to discrimination or harassment and women's cases are taken seriously, that would have an automatic effect in the institution. It often does. We need to make it clear to management at all levels that teams should seek parity. If you have a team working on anything, you should always have parity of men and women. We should always ensure that if there's a special project or engagement, you don't just put one person on the team, but you put a man and a woman. Or at least if one person's a lead, you have a woman or a man backing them up, so you get the 2 viewpoints. And then there's obvious things, merit-based recruitment. Avoid recruitment through networks. Avoid relying on the old boys network. These aren't complicated, but they require a decision by leadership to apply modern or more transparent management processes. The final point is what Brian's saying. Leadership is clearly the key. At the end of the day, you need leaders and managers to apply policy throughout the institution. So if we're going to talk about good governance, we need to talk about good governance at every level, and we need to have consistent and fair process at every level. That didn't quite answer the question. So.
but it was interesting. So, if I may build on that for Kristina, because one of the things that you've said is when you select candidates and you have different options and how to go about it. I think one possible mechanism that I think, especially in Scandinavia, they use quite often is the use of a nomination commission when we're talking about the election of board members. Could you maybe say a bit more about what such a nomination commission is doing and whether, to your opinion, this is a good mechanism or not to get women into board positions?
Yes, I know that is discussed about nominated committees or not. Is it democratic or not? And I know it's ongoing, so I will not go into that discussion. What I was curious to see what happens in the perspective of finding women and men that is good for the ultimate team of the executive committee, as an example. Let's say we all want an optimal team with good human beings developing sport, consisting of women and men together. So if you have a situation that you have, you will nominate a lady, or I will be nominated for that position. I write a nomination paper where I'm suitable for that position. One option is to do that, and you all open the floor to nominating persons. You have to fill in a paper, and you have probably sometimes approved by member organization into that to accept that this person is good to nominate. So let's say that you had 12 nominations, but you have 5 seats for the ENGSO. Then that General Assembly need to decide who 5 to elect for these 12 positions. And if you open to these General Assembly consisting of, like, 60 member organizations, how can they act? And how do they act and find the ultimate team of good ENGSO members acting together? Well, it's tough work, of course. So that is something ongoing, and I know that is the sport. Many of the sport organizations act like that. And of course, it will be a lot of lobbying, a lot of acting, and house and then, and probably get a team. But is it the ultimate team? Is it a good team for really creative, developing, acting for the sport, consisting of men and women? It's a question mark for me. But it works, and that is a world of sport. So don't argue about that. An alternative that we have in the Nordic countries is that we have a nominating committee. And that nominating committee is elected by the member organization. Let's say 60 of them, they elect these nominating committees. And as we have in Sweden, we say that the nominating committees should be men and women, because men know men, women know women. So that's a good balance in the nominating committee. The nominating committee's task is on the behalf of all the member organizations to make a proposal of the best ultimate executive committee. Not to decide, but a proposal. So in the same situation, if you have 12 nominations coming into the ENGSO, you have 5 seats. The nominating committee select and discuss about this according to the criteria that exist. For example, ultimate team means women and men experience this and knowledge there together to ultimate. They make a proposal to the General Assembly. The General Assembly can adopt it, but they can also question it and put other persons in. So it's a democratic way. So looking at gender equality and gender perspective, I think it could be a better way, because if you have a nominating committee, you can have also the criteria, you can make it visible. How can they make a proposal? You can open discussion that the nominating committee, men and women together, need to find ultimate team of women and men, try to find it. Still it's democratic, in my view. So I think it's a more guarantee for getting the ultimate team of a balanced group.
And so it's common use in the Nordic countries.
Yes.
So, yeah. Okay.
And that was the first step we took in Sweden, actually, in 1989, that the nominating committee should consist of men and women equal. Because men know men, women know women. So networking, and then make the proposal of the executive committee. So that was a first strategic step for us to take.
Is this something as a mechanism that is that you have as well within the Caribbean, or do you have similar mechanisms to encourage?
No, I'm focused on the practical aspect of it. How it's going to happen, and who's going to make it happen. Essentially, what this is about, that suggestion, is about constitutional reform. Because, again, national Olympic committees, autonomous bodies, with their own constitution, it is a political situation. You have to get elected. You have to, the politics involves not just the history and tradition of the NOC, but the members that make up the NOC, which is the National Federation. So it's an elected process. How and who is going to lead that process to get constitutional reform. A number of NOCs don't even have term limitations as yet, which I believe is a key driving force to facilitate and open up. Because we also have to appreciate that when we talk about inclusion and diversity, we are all focused quite rightly on gender. But you also have the issue of race, you also have the issue of all different things in the context of the overall sport ecosystem becoming more modernized and reflective of the society in the modern world. But I can't overemphasize the importance of top-down, because I don't know of any NOC that I'm aware of that you can stage a coup just so. It's just not the makeup of the Olympic and sporting movement. A lot of times leaders pass the baton. It's succession planning, which is a key part of good governance principles. So if it's only one takeaway from my time here, which I'm always happy to talk about gender, because it's something I'm extremely passionate about. Because being a single parent, growing up in very challenged circumstances, my mother is my hero. I saw her bring up her 4 children, survive an abusive marriage, well, walk away from an abusive marriage, make ends meet, bring up 4 children, and was able, in the main, to keep them out of jail, even though 1 or 2 of them may have come close. But it speaks to me of the power and influence that women can have and the difference that they make. And whether it is personal, because we all have conscious biases, my passion and dedication and commitment for gender balance and gender equality is a tribute to my mother, who can't really enjoy seeing what her troublesome son has become because she has Alzheimer's. So for me, I've always been surrounded by resilient, indomitable women. And I genuinely believe that we are losing a lot, whether it is in politics, business, sports, by not mainstreaming women. People may not share my view, but women are still in the main outsiders in IOC sport and the Olympic movement. We need to bring them into the tent in a meaningful way. And I will continue to insist, he for she. At this point in time, we all have to work together, but to move the needle in the Olympic movement, you need all the men in this room who are involved in the NOCs to be champions for it, and to be really sincere and not feel threatened by it. You know, no offense to my colleagues, but I have sat around the tables of in many different forums from all over the world. This president for life kind of attitude and thinking leads to the behaviors that shuts the door. You know, so again, it's about accepting and acknowledging, it's about measurement. I think that there are things that can be done to nudge, using a concept from behavioral economics, because it's not only about punitive. You have to nudge. You have to reward and encourage and celebrate the behaviors you want, whether that is in the form of Olympic solidarity, how they apportion grants. What I'm simply saying is that we have to be real. You know, we can't talk around the subject, and we can't come up with all these nice theories, and nobody, or we don't have that critical mass of behaviors and thinking that will tip it and get us to where it ought to be, which is in the governance and in the leadership. It mirrors what the Olympic movement and all of us Olympic leaders here are pushing for. We are pushing and pressing our athletes, our coaches, our NFs. We need to put the same pressure on ourselves.
Before we open discussion up to the floor, I want to ask one question to all of you, so feel free who wants to contribute. We also have a drafting committee that is trying to come up with resolutions and conclusions from this forum. And one of the elements that we have been discussing is the use of quota, which has been also mentioned earlier. So before opening the floor, I just want to ask, you've been quite like-minded so far, so I wonder if if you also have the same opinion on quota. So do you think it's a good system? And what is your experience with it, basically?
Okay, I'm much more familiar with conventional politics, which is nasty enough. Political parties control the game. Quotas clearly work for women in a conventional political system, because not only men, but often women don't trust women to be good leaders. So there's a whole range of elements you've got to pressure if you have a political system. Now, the voting mechanism or the electoral mechanism within the Olympic committees is very different. There's no party political system, there's no parliament. Votes are not made by a large group of people, by a handful, rather by a handful of individuals. Typically, electoral systems in institutions like the IOC copy the culture of governance within the country. So within Scandinavia, you've got a much more sophisticated democratic governance structure, and they have probably a more sophisticated system nomination that works very well. But we're looking at changing the IOC internationally, and I'm sure the context is completely different as you go from country to country across Africa and Asia or to other parts of the world. So I think, yes, I absolutely would support quotas. But I would argue possibly that the bigger pressure is money. And rather than in the European structures, when you leave Europe, it could be that the way in which national Olympic committees get extra funding, that could be also a very good lever.
Okay. Brian, please. Or Donna.
Oh, it's such a... My mind is going round and round in circles because I don't have a clear answer. And even we asked the question in our research as well, for male and female board members, and there isn't a definitive answer. And if there was, we'd have got it right by now, right? We would have equality. So, and quotas is one method that we can use or that we can try. It certainly helps. It helps to engage the conversation and break down the old boys network. It helps to say we have to look around and we have to have diversity at the table. It becomes a limiting factor when organizations think they've ticked the box. And 30% is it. And it can affect confidence in terms of, am I just in this position because I'm representing the whole of women? And from the other perspective is the female that's put into the place because of quotas, does she have the skills to do the job? Not once in our research did anybody question if any of the men sat at the table had the skills to do the job. And I think we also have to look at the other way. What if we had a maximum male quota in governance? What if we push the needle the other way? What if we say, because there are some boards that are also all female. And it's not just the numbers, it's where those people are in the organizations. So again, it's not just reaching a quota, but if they're not in decision-making positions, if they're not the chairman or chairperson, or the president or the vice president, or if they're not there. And we have to think about sustainability, legacy, and strategy into the future. How do we sustain this? How do we find the pathway that comes through so that the women who, if we use quotas from the national federations, make it into the international federations so that there will be enough women in the IOC and there will be a female president or vice president or whatever. So we have to look at it strategically. And I think we use networks and we're very short-sighted in terms of strategy, in terms of recruitment plans. If we look at athletes, we create plans, playground to podium in the UK. How are we going to get this athlete to win that gold medal? And we're very structured, we're very goal-orientated, we work on 4-year cycles, we're very clear on if you achieve this, you get to move up, you get to move up. We don't have the same pathways in terms of going up to coaching or into umpiring or into leadership. We just expect that if there are enough women here, they'll suddenly appear here. So we have in sport this very structured performance pathway, and we don't offer the same pathway or roadmap or whatever we want to call it to move to get the women into the board positions, into decision-making board positions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure.
The other thing that we mustn't forget in the whole conversation about governance and gender balance, that's why I said earlier, gender balance, is that I actually tell people, not to scare them off, but just as a statement of fact, sport politics is probably rougher than the real politics. It is a physical sport, literally. And I say that to put a context that there are males and females who will tell you they don't want to subject themselves to the rough and tumble. I don't know necessarily there's a way around that. Again, I'm saying, I remember even when I was, after having served for Secretary General of the TTOC for 8 years, we have term limitation, and I decided to run for the presidency. So I know I'm not everybody's cup of tea, but it was an interesting situation. 90% of my colleagues on the TTOC board didn't support my efforts. I respected their point of view, and I simply threw myself into the cauldron, not worrying about whether I won or lost. I believed in something, and I believe that you have to stand up for it. So I say that simply to say, and I know many competent people who, for example, when I was trying to put together a team to contest the next election, the last election in TTOC, and to take it to 50-50. It wasn't easy, because there were males and females that I wanted, because I wanted to modernize the organization, bring in certain skill sets within the Constitution. And there were males and females who told me flat out, they're not subjecting themselves to that pressure. So I'm saying that to say that there is not one approach and one thing that we have to do to move it forward, and we shouldn't underestimate the scale and the scope of the challenge, because you mentioned, I think, DNA. The DNA of the Olympic movement goes back to 776 BC. And in the beginning, they didn't have women. And I say that not to make anybody feel bad, but to state that there is a cultural and sociological and traditional and historical instinct that we mustn't underestimate in terms of moving the boat.
But likewise, and you said this to start with, we can't use it as an excuse either. Yes. You're saying, you know, you have to be brave, we have to, and I think there's a lot of sports that do say that kind of.
I wasn't saying anything.
No, but I'm because you are being brave, you are changing, you are moving forward. So yeah.
Okay,
I think the quota it's a difficult question, and I think it's not easy. It depends on the culture where you are, the country culture, the organization country, I think I cannot say yes or no to it, because I think you must start in another way, because it could be wrong, because you could focus on the wrong thing, on figures, as you say, check in the box. We had neither. So that's not the situation. But I think it's quite easy. If you want to make a change, you need first of all to look, where are you? What are the situation in your organization or in your country? What are the challenges you are facing? That is, where are you? Secondly, where do you want to go? And one of the ultimate goals is, of course, that we want a sport for girls and boys, women and men. That's all agreed. So that's the goal, and here we are. Then, third, say, how do we go there? And make actions and intermediate goals so you can measure and monitor all the time. One of the means are the decision-making, the percentage. Because we know if women and men, the ultimate team I'm talking about, then we have a good sport for girls and boys, women and men. So how to reach that decision-making, gender-balanced group? How to reach that? Well, different way of doing it, depending on the culture, where you are. So I think it's not easy, and what we did in Sweden, for example, we did not take the quotas. We did not. But we have it as a little pressure. So we develop, we monitor and see. And we discuss, is this good? Is the quotas we're discussing, is it good to have 20% women only in the boards? So then you get a good, it's not quotas, but you have it as a pressure. So that's, I mean, it's not the formal quotas. You discuss the quotas, but you not have the formal thing, because that was you're discussing. So I think the key is to decide, where are you, want to reach, strategic actions, monitoring, following up.
Yeah, a step-by-step approach according to the culture.
How easy could it be? Is it easy?
Yeah. All right, since the title of the panel is Everybody Should Get Involved, I hope we get a lot of questions from the floor. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand. Maybe say also your name and organization and who you would like to answer, to ask the question to.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting ideas. Of course, we all agree, and I also agree that gender equality is one of the bases for good governance of our organizations, and especially for the NOCs which I represent. And my question goes to Mrs. Kristina Thuree. I liked there was a good idea about nomination committee. Of course, on one hand, I have to admit that it will be something very tricky to realize within the National Olympic Committees, within our institutional rules and statutes, etc. But still, I need to know more in-depth information. How this nominative committee is elected and how we get the membership for these nominative committees that they have to make good proposals for that males and females for achieving this good balance. Maybe this is something that we can realize, analyze for our future incorporation in our organizations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to answer that. And as you say, it's a long way to go. You cannot do it immediately because it's the culture and the way sport is structured, for example, the NOCs. So be patient and see if you want to have that as a solution, because that could be a strategic action in one organization or not. You decide. But I can explain how we do it in Sweden, in the Nordic countries. The nominating committee, it's in the statutes. Let's say the Swedish Sports Confederation, the Swedish Olympic Committee. In the statute it said that the member organization at the General Assembly elect the nominating committee. And it consists of, for example, 10 persons. And we did that in Sweden in '89. There's 5 men and 5 women, because that was strategic-wise important. Before that, it could be mostly men, it was, of course. But we did that. But the member organization, it's in the statutes that they elect the nominating committee. And, of course, that could be also a tricky thing to do. So therefore we have, what is the English word for it? Revisorer. Can someone help me? Just lost the English word. Someone, of course, proposed a good person nominating committee, but it's open for the General Assembly to decide, okay, we want these persons in the nominating committee. So then they are elected at the General Assembly. Then, for the coming General Assembly, let's say for 2 years, what they do, when the nominations come into the Federation or the Olympic Committee, the nomination with letters, explanations, CV, etc., then the nominating committee review these. And they review this according to criteria that has been discussed earlier in the General Assembly. What are the important criteria for a good executive committee? So the nominating committee review all nominations, but they are also transparent for all member organizations, so they review them at the same time. But the nominating committee is it's a support to facilitate the electing procedure at the coming General Assembly. The nominating committee review well, let's say, we find these 5 are the best to fulfill the criteria of having a good ultimate team. And then propose to the General Assembly. And at the same time, the member organizations have read it, they have reviewed it, and they can admit with that, or they can say, no, we don't like that, we take others. And then it's open democratic discussion at the General Assembly. And it happens sometimes that the nominating committee's proposal will be challenged by extra names from the nominations. So that's the way we do it. Easy to, but it takes time to change your regulations and your statutes.
Sarah, please.
Hi. This, I think, is a question for you, Donna, and I think it's because, to me, words like committees and assemblies and structures and processes are kind of missing the point about what the next generation is likely to want. And how do we... So my question for you is, what do you think we can do to get more young people involved in instilling the kind of values and the culture that makes sense to them, rather than trying to work within the structures that were invented by the people before us? How can more younger people get involved in this debate?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm a lecturer at a university, and I teach international sport management. My cohort is half Dutch, it's in the Netherlands, and half international. So I might have 60 nationalities in my classroom. And I was teaching a class about gender in sport. And these are 18, 19-year-olds. And we were talking about women's sport. And I was absolutely shocked by their response to, but it's not as interesting as men's sport, and I don't want to watch women's sport, and they don't have the TV coverage, and they don't have... This is the next generation. These are people, these are students that have an international perspective, that have chosen to come onto a sport management program, that are the next leaders of sport, that are telling me that women's sport is not as interesting or as relevant as men's sport. And that shocked me, because I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe we haven't got it sorted, but the next generation will. But unless we do something to help educate the next generation, we're going to perpetuate it. And it is about role models, and it's about sustainability and what we see. And we have to push back and not assume that the next generation will get it right. So what can we do to help the next generation? I think it's an understanding of what governance is. And I think we have to engage the diversity, and that is not just gender but age, in governance as well. We have to figure out a way to get the younger generation involved in governance. You see younger people involved in athletes' committees, and obviously that's difficult because of commitments to the sport and things like that, but I think as well we have to be more open to how do we engage the younger population and show best practice. And I think we also need to look outside of sport into other areas of governance. Look to Silicon Valley, that is young and fresh and exciting and really open to unconscious bias and gender training and those kind of things, and figure out how can we put that into our club systems, into our school sports systems, so that, again, culturally, we're making the changes, and we have to make it younger, because we're just continuing with the same culture, if not. Yes, well, my class is predominantly males, because that's who we get. We try and positively recruit females, going back to the quota system, but it's predominantly males. But internationally, females were also, the female students were, they also want to work in the men's sport because that's more powerful and that's more high profile. And so, yeah, we have to change that. The Dutch women just won the European football championships in the summer. 3/4 of the Dutch population watched that final. Don't tell me that women's sport isn't, powerful and interesting and has commercial value, because we can see that. But we have to, engage and keep pushing back at that.
Okay, interesting question.
Can I just comment? Because I think what you're saying is, I think it's also the good governance. What is sport? What is male sport? What is female sport? I mean, when you hear such comments from your students, I mean, they measure it that the male sport is the norm. I mean, it's not interesting in female sport. And I think one of the speakers today said, interesting, the men and women are not the same, but they should be equal. Yeah. But to realize, because I heard men saying that when you put your glasses on and look on female football as being female football is much more interesting. But you should not see that it's a female playing football, male football, so to say. So I mean, to understand what is it you're looking at. Because I think you're the norm, and that is something I think could be disturbing, that comments you have.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Yeah. So I'm Susanna Rahk, I'm the Vice President of the Finnish Olympic Committee. Actually, like to comment that, sorry, it's not a question, but it was just some interesting topic of how we perceive female and male sport. And I've been fighting in Finland with the media of kind of it's almost impossible to follow up the female sports in media, how they kind of improve. For example, the ball games. So you come and maybe see the finals, but you don't see how they get there. So it's not that interesting. While in the same time, you can follow up the male sport, kind of how the teams end up being there on the finals. And gradually, it's starting to change. But I think that is also why it impacts for being involved if you want to be a sport administrator and in a business, because the big money is there, which is in the media, which shows there. So if you want to make a career there, of course you want to go there. But I think it is a cultural change in many ways. It is a media. How do we see it in everyday life? And therefore, we have to work in many sides. But thank you. That was an interesting kind of a topic. You kind of lifted up.
Okay.
Hi. Hello again. Sorry. I have a question for the panelists and for a reflection. I think in here we should understand what do we mean by good governance, because governance is actually in place, and most of the people that are leading the governance would think it is already working, but we have some kind of status, and probably we want, as you were saying, challenge the status and go somewhere. In my point of view, I think that to have a good governance, so to integrate this gender perspective and to bring change and institutional change, we might be looking also outside of the topic or sports. So what do you think if good governance brings into the process also who is able to change the path? For instance, the education environment or the media that have also a role to play. So they are not into the sport thing, but they also can support and promote the change. So what do you think about that?
Anybody willing to take that question?
Well, I'll start. Understanding what governance is really critical. And I think if we consider governance the oversight and management of the institutions, And then we start looking at how well they're managing and oversight, how the quality of the oversight and management. Clearly, it has to be transparent. And from what I'm learning about the IOC's approach to elections, sometimes they're more, sometimes they're less transparent. I would argue it also needs to follow basic rules of law, which would argue it needs to be fair and democratic. Now, there's different types of democracy around the world, and I get the impression that within the European context, certainly that process is followed. Meritocratic is a real challenge, because I'm not sure how you measure whether a process is meritocratic or not. But I'm deliberately doing this because I also feel that putting out key principles of what good governance are is the way in which you can then move to a position that's better than the past. I think one of the better measures of how fair or how good governance is how transparent and accountable they genuinely are. And I would argue the role of the media, for professional media, is to hold governance structures to account. And this is why we see issues like the current issues in Brazil the media's ahead of the case, and now it's inevitable that the detail has to be looked at properly. So I tend to see on one side you've got governance, and on the other side you have structures which hold governance to account. And you need both of those aspects. That could be civil society, could be citizenry, it could be other organs. But that's how I would kind of measure it up. How you define good governance, I think, is an issue better for people who understand the Olympic movement than people who don't. But certainly I think transparency is a critical issue, which I think is at times questionable. Probably not in Europe, but certainly in other parts of the world.
I hang on the transparency issue, then continue that, because I think for good governance, transparency of the election procedure, how it goes, how you get positions, but also I want to add a thing, that is about resources for participation. Yeah. Transparency there, and good governance is that secure that girls and boys, women and men get the same possibility to take part in sport. That means to act sport, to have the facilities to do sport, to have the money to make sport. That's good governance, to distribute money, you distribute facilities like halls, and when you can practice sport is in the morning, late nights, etc. That's also part of the good governance. And to secure that the sport is balanced in that content for participation, of course, women and men need to act together, because we know we have different experiences, different knowledge, in order to support and secure that all can participate in sport. That's a good governance for me in broader perspective. From grassroots sports to top elite sport. Grassroots sport, don't forget about that, children, etc. What type of facility do they have? When can they practice sport? When do girls go? Boys, leaders, coaches, to act, and transparency about that.
To add to what you're saying, in addition, you have attributes such as equity, democracy, it must be representative, transparency, accountability, even effectiveness, efficiency, but there's also responsiveness. And there are those who say that responsiveness is tied into being representative, because you have to be responsive to your stakeholders, in particular the pain and hurt that they suffer, whether it be athletes, whether it be anybody. And the only way you can get that is to have the conversation and the inclusion. So, I mean, it may sound a bit esoteric, but you know, those are some of the things, and again, it ties back into the topic that we are on, which is good governance as it relates to gender equality, gender balance, why it is important to have the inclusion, and it includes gender, because it is about how do you as a leader, as a governing body, respond to the issues, concerns, hurts, and pains. It's about empathy. So you can't have empathy if you're not listening.
And if I can just finally add, because I agree with the comments here, the transparency and the accountability, but from an education perspective as well, I think from a governance perspective, a lot of people in governance, especially in sport, are in a voluntary basis. They are there because they can be and because they have a passion about the sport. Doesn't necessarily mean they have the skill set or the education from a governance perspective, from a business perspective. And I think we have to be accountable to that as well. And from our research, for example, something we weren't expecting was the power of the chairs within meetings. And this is where I come back to equity and not just equality. The power of a chair to set the tone in a meeting situation. And that's a skill. That's a skill that you need to learn and to develop and to practice and be reflective upon, our unconscious bias that we all have, and to be aware of that and to set the tone. Who should be the chair of the meeting, and what skills does that person need in order to do that in an equitable way? And I think that's something that sometimes we overlook in terms of, skills and qualifications that you need to govern once you're there.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Is the bar open? You should do your exercise now. Is the bar open?
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm representing the International Sport and Culture Association, also representative of the Estonian Olympic Committee. And I just wanted to follow up what was said before about young people. And I just want to say that it's equally important in good governance to also include the young person. So to have the dialogue of what they expect and how to empower with them. So if you have a look around this room also, you can say that we have some work to do in this matter. Thank you.
Definitely.
All right, if there are no other, there's another question over there.
Hello, my name is Revital. I'm the president of water polo in Israel, and I'm part of the board of the NOC in Israel, new one, just been elected. But I think our work, or the IOC work, is to start thinking how we can change by sport the education in really early ages. Because we need to educate. It's about educate. And women, if we want to educate and help them to believe in themselves and to believe that they're equal, and like I can say I was a sport woman and I was playing water polo in the national team, but I start believing in myself that I can make a change in the age of 40. And this is something that the IOC needs to understand and really start doing it, not just talking about it. We need to make a change.
Leave the change. Leave the change. Don't leave it. Okay. If there are no more questions, I think you would probably not mind if we stop this panel a bit earlier. But before we go, I would like to ask one question to each of the panelists. We've been talking about strategy, gradual development, and so on. So my question to you would be, what would be your key message and maybe key action that you think leaders in this room should take from this discussion?
Well, as a man, and seeing that possibly just over 10% of the audience are men, it does concern me that we're underrepresented in this type of fora where we're dealing with such an important issue. Probably there's some natural selection in who comes to this kind of meeting. But in the spirit of the He for She campaign, I would actually ask every man in this room and every man we know linked to the Olympic movement to consider very seriously what action can they take when they get back to their countries. What specific action can they take in their job to try and drive consciously forward gender equality, either within the management of the institution, or in the support for sportswomen, or in the oversight structures. But I would argue that, I mean, if I had more time, I'd like to whiteboard it and get everybody to commit, and all the men make one commitment. But I would hope that you can make that, write it down on your pad in front of you, write down one commitment that you're going to act on in the next 2 weeks or 1 month, and you really have to do it. So I would like to send you all my email address so you can tell me what you're committed to. But that's the way I would approach it, because I really genuinely believe that this type of change is achievable. It's ambitious. But if everybody takes a step now, we're going to get somewhere. We've got to stop being intransigent because we think that it's out of our control. It's not. If we all take action, things will change. But that means everybody we know has to take action. So maybe you can also get 1, 2 colleagues to do the same.
Okay.
Thank you.
Kristina.
Okay, I have 2 things. One is the strategic-wise. Nevertheless, go home, made your own action plan. Where are you? What challenges do you have? Where do you want to reach? And what steps do you need to take in order to reach that? And start monitoring. Easy done, easy do. But then I have a low-hanging fruit, the second one. Go home and see. When you have a forum or when you have a seminar, invite men and women to speak. When you write your next newsletter, telling the group a report from this conference, make pictures of women and men. That is, to live the change, show men and women together, act together. That's a low-hanging fruit.
Right.
Just 3 quick things. I must apologize. I have a little emergency, so I really need to be excused, but 3 quick things. Okay. Be the change that you want to see. Action speaks louder than words, and practice what we preach.
Okay. It's clear. Donna, please.
Just again mirroring. It's hard being at the end because you take all the good points before they get to me. I would say be brave. Be brave. That was something that Marital Castillo said to me in terms of her leadership role and how she's got to where she is. Be brave. Be brave. 30% is not equality. 50% is equality. Be brave. We play in sport. We play by the rules. I think we have to be braver to set the rules. And if you don't play by the rules, you can't bring your ball and play. And I think we have to be brave.
Okay. Thank you. So we all got some homework to do, it seems. I want to thank all the panelists, and I want to thank you to stay with us. So, thank you very much.
The speakers of the second panel here. So one more, maybe we could give a round of applause. So it was a fruitful and interesting discussion here, and I think this one was even more interesting because it was about the actions. What should be done, or what actions should be taken in order to achieve this advancement of leadership among women in the leading positions. And this concludes our program for today, and we invite everyone who is not busy today to join us at the buffet here at the Riverside Restaurant, starting 7 p.m. And for the rest of you, we'd like to thank you for being with us here today, and we would like to see you all back here 8:30 in the morning tomorrow. So 8:30 sharp, starting with the third panel discussion, and we'll be discussing one of the topics already elaborated upon here, that is education as a tool in developing leadership and specific measures to foster women's leadership. So thank you and see you tomorrow.